Today in our gospel reading, Jesus is taking a few of the disciples on a hike. It's one of those stories that starts out fine, but turns into a story we are not quite sure we can believe. It challenges us. We have concerns and questions that make us doubt the story as it is described. The question then becomes, can you believe enough to be transformed into who God calls you to be? So what was the experience up a high mountain that Matthew, Mark, and Luke all tell us about? What is the event that we call the transfiguration of Jesus? In our modern scientific world, we expect to be able to explain everything. And if we can't explain it, then in our technologically oriented society, we are convinced that it must have been some kind of sci-fi theological trick. We might be able to believe Jesus shining brightly because this works with our belief that he is God. But we don't know how we feel about the disciples seeing their saints of the past. No, we want it all figured out, and we want to obtain information that will benefit us and answer all our questions. We don't want our questions and doubts to be answered with the simple words, "You must have faith." When we consider the symbolism of inspiration for us that's packed into this story, we recognize a bright light represented God's holiness and his blessing on selected people of God whom had encountered God. It is said of Jesus that his face shone like the sun and his clothes became dazzling white. If you were one of the disciples, this would have reminded you of another story. To the ancient Hebrew mind, there was something mystical about mountaintops. Such places were associated with God's dwelling place. And the mystery of God is what draws us to climb the mountain in the first place. We each desire to have an encounter with God, and that desire is found deep within us. A possible experience on the mountaintop offers us the anticipation of a surprise, of a revelation, or a change. If you remember your Old Testament stories, we recall how Moses' appearance changed when he came down from his encounter with God on Mount Sinai with the Ten Commandments. The people looked at him and became afraid. Scripture tells us Moses did not know that his face shone because he had been talking with God. And when Aaron and all the Israelites saw Moses, the skin of his face was shining, and they were afraid to come near him. I guess that will happen when you have a mountaintop experience with God. So I'd like to consider this morning three aspects of this story: the climb up, the event at the top, and the coming down. Most important, we will remember that Jesus was not only present, but the focus of each aspect of the story. First, the climb up. How many of you have ever climbed a mountain? Okay, all right. When I was growing up, we would go camping in upstate New York, and the lake where we swam had a mountain across the way from it. And when we were old enough, a group of us, teenagers and one chaperone, would climb the mountain. My brother, who was older than I, climbed it many times. And we would row across the lake in a boat, tie up the boat, cross the main road, that's why we had to have a chaperone, and then climb up the mountain. Anyway, I remember the climb to be very challenging. In fact, I only went once. That shouldn't surprise anybody. There was no set path, and we were just told to keep climbing upward. And at the top, it was worth the climb because we could look out over the lake and we could see the boats as if they were tiny little toys down below. We would raise a flag on a tree to signal to our parents that we had made it. And to me, that mountain seemed so big. We never saw any danger in what we were doing. We just followed the leader and climbed. And there was a certain amount of faith needed to follow someone else and trust that we would arrive at the top. I wonder if that's how the disciples felt. Just follow Jesus and climb. The climb was an important part of the journey for the three chosen disciples. We know them to be Peter, James, and John, often called Jesus' inner circle. We don't know why, but not everyone was invited to go. These three didn't know the details of what was ahead for them. And even if Jesus had told them, they could not have anticipated it. I wonder if they encountered danger and were tempted to turn around. I wonder if they grew tired and thought, why do we have to do this? I wonder if they laughed at themselves as fishermen who were now far from the water climbing a mountain. Perhaps we have similar questions about what Jesus asks us to do. Do you ever ask yourself questions like, why is this faith journey so hard? Or where is this path leading? Or why would Jesus ask us to travel what seems to be such a difficult journey with obstacles and suffering at every turn? But the disciples did trust Jesus and make the climb. They arrive at the top of the mountain, and Jesus immediately enters into prayer. Mark and Luke's gospel tell us that it was when he was praying that Jesus' transfiguration occurred. And this alone could have been too much for the disciples to witness, to get a glimpse of God's glory, to see their master and their friend aglow, radiating as if he were the sun. Nobody had ever seen God, and here we are seeing the fullness of God in Jesus. Even Moses only shined in the face. No, this was different. This was overwhelming. This was terrifying. But it was also not the first time that they experienced the miracles of Jesus. This same Jesus called them away from their fishing. This same Jesus walked on the water, defying everything the disciples knew about nature and water. This same Jesus told the wind to cease, and it obeyed. And now this very same Jesus was in conversation on the mountaintop with their ancestors and with God. How much more can we take? But there is more. Peter suggests building three structures. But that suggestion is not received very well. God speaks from heaven. This is my Son, the beloved. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him. Listen to the loving message as found in the New Living Translation. This same verse, it says, "This is my dearly loved Son who brings me great joy." Listen to him. The lesson the disciples learned quite quickly was that Jesus was not on an equal level to their ancestors. While Moses and Elijah were extremely important men in the history of Israel, Jesus was more. Jesus was Messiah. Jesus was the one to listen to, relate to, follow, and obey. This was a critical time for Jesus and his mission. This holy time of encouragement would help to sustain Jesus for what was to come. And the lesson we learn along with the disciples is to listen to Jesus. It was no time for the disciples to be distracted, and there's no time for us to be distracted either. Our Matthew text tells us that the disciples fell on their face in fear. That makes sense. We can relate to that. After all, how often do you hear God speaking? And they tremble. But it's the voice of Jesus that once again reassures them to not be afraid. We don't know how long they were up on that mountain, but we can be sure the disciples were physically, emotionally, and spiritually shocked after the encounter that they had. We get that. Have you ever had a mountaintop epiphany? A mountaintop experience where you encountered Jesus? And did you give into it fully, mind, body, and soul? Because if you did, I'm sure the encounter changed you. Not everyone has a mountaintop experience, but those who do never forget and are forever changed. There's another lesson of the Transfiguration. Jesus revealed his divinity, his true self, the glory of the Father revealed in the Son. What will we do with that piece of information? What was left for the disciples to do? What was left was to come down, to rejoin the others. Do you think they wanted to? Or do you think they wanted to stay on that mountain and bask in what had happened and watch and wait for more? The temptation of the mountaintop is to cling to the moment forever, to never come down, to bask in the revelation and the presence of God felt so powerfully. Moments of high religious ecstasy are important, but they are offered to us from a God who calls us forward into the future. And that usually means come down from the mountain and go back into the world. We cannot stay on the mountaintop forever. There's work to be done. There are lives to be touched with the love of Christ down in the valley. And yet in this story, there's another hard part for the disciples. Matthew 17:9 says, as they went back down the mountain, Jesus commanded them, tell no one about the vision until after the Son of Man has been raised from the dead. This must have been really hard, especially for Peter, James, and John. They did at least share the blessing of each other, having witnessed this together. I think that's key for us to recognize. Once again, we see Jesus caring for the disciples in community together so they could rely on one another for, let's call it, pastoral care. The coming down off the mountain is an important lesson for us from this event in the life of Jesus. We live in the world among the people of God, and we cannot separate ourselves completely from the world because the world is our mission field. We're called to tell the world of God's love found in Jesus. And if we don't come down the mountain, nobody will know. If we don't share our mountaintop experiences, how will anyone else be encouraged to climb the mountain and seek the face of God? No, coming down from the mountain with the adrenaline flowing through our veins because we are filled with the Spirit is what Jesus is counting on from his disciples. What if the church lived out its life in such a way that others could not help but notice? And what if Christians were the ones whose faces glowed with the love of Jesus so that people pointed their finger and said, hey, look at that? And what if we lived out the extravagant love, salvation, peace, and hope in God in such a way that we seemed odd and out of place in the world? Can we believe enough to allow God to change us and then through us change the world around us? This is our mission, to represent and represent Christ to the world. We are to go and tell. We are to go and show and tell. Jesus calls us today, just like he called those disciples, to join him up on the mountain. Let us join him in his mission of love and grace. Thanks be to God. Amen.